Thanks for coming out. This is my standard shtick. For those of you who come to many of these, you'll know what I do. But for those of you, I see a few new faces out here. Just want to introduce myself as Benjamin Hale. I'm the interim director of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization. And what we do on campus is basically act as a window for the outside community to sort of see what's going on campus, and also for our students to see and experience a lot of voices from outside of campus who are coming to campus. So we're bringing in people from all sorts of places over the semester. And throughout the year. This year so far, we brought in important speakers like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Roy Teixeira, Danielle Allen was here last week. And this week, we have Stephen Cambone speaking tonight. Later in the semester, we have 4 more speakers coming up. We have Daniel Mahoney coming up next week, Yuval Levine on March 31st. Our own Jack Duty is going to be giving a talk at Boulder Public Library on April 5th, and our own William Allen is going to be giving a talk on April 13th. If you're interested in any of those talks, please come out and join us for those events. If you've missed some talks that you would have liked to have seen, then you can always go to our website, which is located at this very tiny web address up here, colorado.edu/center/Benson. We have archived talks for most of the talks that have occurred. You can watch them on YouTube while you're running or doing work or what have you. Also, you're welcome to follow us on Twitter. We've gotten more and more Twitter signs that we post around the room, so please don't neglect to follow us there or find us on Facebook or LinkedIn or any one of those other social media outlets. Having said all that, my standard shtick, I'm going to pass the baton to William Allen, who is going to introduce our speakers. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Ben. Good evening. Once again, I'm very happy to be here on this occasion to introduce the next in our series of American national character. Our speaker this evening is Steve Cambone. But before I introduce Dr. Cambone, let me just say a word about this series. You are halfway through, or a little more than halfway through at this point. As you might recall, we began the year with Diana Shaw, who delivered an address on Booker T. Washington. And that was followed by our own Colleen Sheehan, visiting scholar this year, who delivered a talk on civic friendship. And then in December, we had the president of the University of Chicago, Robert Zimmer, who talked to us about the movement on college campuses to assure freedom of inquiry and to avoid safe spaces. Last week, as Ben mentioned, Danielle Allen was here, and she presented a talk on the supermajority. And so you may be asking yourself at this point, what all these things have to do with American national character? And the answer is very simple. The project itself is in search of America. And we know no way to find America other than in her people. And so we are asking the simple question, who are they? And are they in any way one? Which is to say, is there anything that defines Americans in such a way as to reveal what it is that makes America what it is or might be? And so the series will continue. A week from tonight, Daniel Mahoney will be here. Mahoney is a professor at Assumption College, and and he's also an editor of the American Political Science Association journal, Perspectives in Political Science. He is an authority on Alexis de Tocqueville, who, of course, is in some ways the first commentator on American national character, at least in an academic way. What we have been doing in the conference, and will continue after Mahoney with Levine, and with my concluding talk in the series, is nothing less than to seek to provide an accounting. Now, some 2 centuries into this grand experiment, it seems fit to undertake an accounting. And some 6 years prior to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, it seems necessary to conduct an accounting. After all, the jury may still be out on the experiment. And so nothing can be of greater value than for us to make an assessment and to provide for the public generally, but certainly for the academic world in particular, an approach to the question which perhaps will have the value of giving entry into a sustained discourse. So in the concluding address to be given on April the 13th, I will be at great pains both to remember all that has been said this year and also to provide something of a paradigm based on what has been said not only this year, but in the 3 years prior in this American National Character Project, for it has been a 3-year project, not here at CU, but beginning, of course, at Villanova University, where Dr. Sheehan and I collaborated in order to launch it. And over the course of that period of time, we have produced already several conferences and several papers, published papers, all of which will be finally collected in a single volume to address this question and make it available to you. So I urge you to come back next Tuesday, come back March 31st, come back April 13th, and see how it all wraps up. Tonight, our interest is being directed specifically to the topic of American national character, perhaps more specifically than any single talk in the course of the series so far this year. Steve Cambone is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Cyber Initiatives at Texas A&M University, system-wide. There, he's responsible for developing a system-wide interdisciplinary cybersecurity program. And in this role, he works with the academic and research professors and the schools and centers at that flagship campus, Texas A&M, and other parts of the system. He also served, quite notably, as the first Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And he had prior service in the Department of Defense as the Director of the Office for Program Analysis and Evaluation, and as the Principal Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy. He has been responsible for a number of important initiatives in American national defense, beginning with his service reviewing our nuclear posture at Los Alamos several years ago and providing direction for repositioning of American defense capabilities. He's also paid attention to the ballistic missile threat to the United States and the nation's space capabilities. He's even spent a little time looking carefully over the United States intelligence community, though that was perhaps prior to some of the most recent performances of the community, and perhaps he needs to go back to that again. Steve also has been active in the world of business. He's been president of a large business unit. He's a board member of a number of private sector companies, and even runs his own company which is called Adirondack, if I remember correctly, the name. His extensive experience in government, business, research, and academia have provided him with a strong background of reflection, not only on the founding principles of the nation, but the current circumstances we face as a nation, which puts him in a particularly valuable position for sharing with us some insights into how we got to where we are, and perhaps also where we might be going. Now, it is also important for me to add one important fact to this resume, and there's so much more, including publications that I'm not going to belabor, but I cannot avoid to say that he is one incredible, or at least once was, one incredible post player on a basketball court. He was the main cause for my having to bulk up just to be able to try to stay on the court with him, which was not in the end successful. But nevertheless, I tried. For, you see, he was a graduate student where I taught at Claremont Graduate School and where he received the PhD degree in political philosophy. He also graduated receiving a BA from the Catholic University of America and an MA also from the Claremont Graduate School. So I have known Steve for a very long time, have followed his career with great interest, and introduce him to you with the assurance that that interest is very well warranted. Steve.
Well, thank you. Thank you, William. So it was 47 years ago. I did the math. I'm not sure which of us is older as a result. Yeah, and I think I made a contribution to your work on Montesquieu, because you would have spent your time on the court instead of in the library, and I drove you to where you belonged. But he didn't tell you, is my wife taught his daughter, Danielle, in third grade, and his son, Mark, who's now a senior executive at Boeing. So we go back a long way. So it's a pleasure to be here. And forgive my voice, and I'm sorry to have to use this microphone, but I've come off the first ever in my life sinus infection, and I still haven't quite recovered my voice. American national character. So Bill calls me up and says, I want you to come and do this lecture for me. And I said, well, Bill, I don't know enough about this subject. And he said, yes, you do it anyway. It'll be good for you. So this was like being back in graduate school, and I said, okay, we'll do it. So I started to think about what it is he wanted me to do, and I must say I got to this talk by a circuitous route, and I hearkened back to a flight I took over northern Afghanistan in a CH-47 helicopter. And I was in this helicopter with a squad of Army Rangers and the deputy commander of the United States Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. And why I was there could be of interest, and we could talk about that at another time. What I was doing there may be of interest to you, but we'll never talk about that. But it happens that the deputy commander of the Joint Special Operations Command was with me. He was the escort, and that was Rear Admiral Bill McCraven. And I see we have a UT folk up here. Howdy. But Bill went on to become the commander of JSOC, and Bill was commander of JSOC when the raid on bin Laden was conducted. And so I've known Bill for some period of time. And then he went on to be the chancellor, as I say, at the University of Texas, which was his alma mater. But prior to assuming that post, Bill gave a commencement address at UT in 2014. And the gist of that address can really be summed up in the first of the axioms that he presented, and it was a simple one. He said, if you want to change the world, start off by making your bed. Okay? So learn to do the little things well was his point, and habituate yourself to doing those things, and you will build your character over a period of time. And so that came to my mind as I started rolling around how to do this. And it struck me that the advice about making your bed was indeed not very far from similar advice that a very young George Washington developed for himself. And again, trying to find a way to sum this up, it was clear that he, George, had the moral resolution to habituate himself to those civil, but in many cases, moral virtues essential to a life well lived in public and in private. Now, as an aside, by the way, Washington had 110 rules. Bill had 10. Bill McCraven had 10. But I won't read you all 110. You can find them for yourself. Some of them are quite amusing. But the first, it seems to me, sums up both all of the rest and the subject of our discussion this evening, and that is, every action done in company, he wrote, ought to be with some sign of respect to those who are present. Right? So that was the very first of his axioms. So this implies a considerable forethought when engaging in company. Empathy, in some cases cunning, given the people you have to engage with in public. And in other cases, affection, but in all cases, a decent respect for the opinions of the people with whom you are present. Now, it's a virtue one would desire to find in citizens of a nation whose founding was justified and ratified on those self-evident truths which all of us have come to know and to cherish, right? In that we were all created equal and have certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So if you're going to live by those principles, it would seem to me the notion of having a decent respect for the opinion of those who are with you is absolutely essential to being able to both to live under those principles and to get along in civil society. But as McCraven and Washington have taught, those virtues are not naturally developed. They are the result of a mixture of habituation, guided by the faculties of reason that can discern their value, those habits, their value to oneself, and if shared with and by others, becomes the basis for the pursuit of lives in public, that is, a political life, that in which we each find ourselves secured together against external threats, and able to live our lives freely in a way that is more fulfilling than we could if we were on our own. Now, Bill, of course, McCraven, was looking to build seals. Right? That's what he looked to do. Washington, on the other hand, was looking to build citizens. And how did he get himself there? Well, he's not called the father of the country for nothing, right? So he had gone through a very long period of time where he had worked very hard to bring about what ultimately was the Constitution of the United States. And he had taken great pains during the course of his career to impress on folks what he thought was going to be necessary in the way of citizenship. But it was when he finally got to his farewell address that he put all of his thought together about what it meant to develop those habits of citizenship that were going to be necessary for this new country to prosper. So what I thought we'd do is we would organize this talk around some of what I think are interesting statements made by successive presidents to look at this question of what is this thing called the American national character, beginning with Washington, going through Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and President Obama. Right? And they share an interesting set of remarks over a period of time, which I'd like to walk us through. So, the farewell is remembered primarily for Washington's admonition that the U.S. avoid foreign entanglements, if one remembers it at all. Read in its entirety, however, it is a description of the character the American people must adopt in Washington's judgment if they're to secure themselves in a hostile world and realize the promise of happiness and prosperity their newly formed republic has made possible. So he begins this address by reminding the audience that the love of liberty is the heart of the nation, but that which constitutes them one people, and that's the phrase he uses, one people, is the unity of government. Now there's a curious phrase. The unity of government constitutes them one people. How could it be that the unity of government is what constituted them as one people? Well, he says this is justly so, for it is the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, that is this unified government, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, your prosperity, that very liberty which you so highly prize. And it is that unity, right, that then modifies a certain form of government. It's not just any government, but a particular form of government that is reflective of their character, because he says to them, he says, you are citizens by birth or choice of a common country. That country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local determination. Well, what is he trying to say? Well, you've committed yourself to this project. And the government, this unified government, is absolutely essential to your being able to get on with the lives you want to live. But it is a form of government which is going to impose upon you certain rules of conduct. And it is going to require, back to his first axiom, that you all have a respect for the opinion of all of your fellows as you go about the business of conducting yourselves under this government, lest the government fail. It cannot be unified if it is impossible for you as citizens to come to agreement amongst yourselves about how you're going to conduct yourselves with one another. So in these sentiments, he says, well, that's nice, but we got to have policy to go with it. It's not just enough to have nice thoughts about one another, but we have to have policies that go with this notion of a unified government. Right? And therefore, we have to foster an interest through those policies in the maintenance of that union. So there's a progression here, right? We've got to have people who can create policies that retain the unity of the government, but we have to remain unified amongst ourselves in order to have the kinds of policies that will allow for this government to persist. So character then gives rise to policy. It is from the character of the people that their policy choices are made, but its implementation, that is the implementation of policy, is the way in which we discipline and habituate ourselves to our civic responsibilities. Right? So we've decided what it is we're going to do. We put in place the rules by which we're going to do them. We accept them in our daily lives, and that's how we come to live our lives every day. Right? So the unity of government, he reminds us, has never been experienced in the form of government that we have, this constitution of government, which he says is better calculated than your former, that is the former form of government, for an intimate union. Now, what an interesting thing. So before we had the Confederation of States, and they were divided amongst themselves, and they were in their local dependencies. And now we've created this national thing. And so somehow, he's arguing, we have got to figure out how we are going to be intimate with one another across a country that ranges 1,800 miles along the border, the Atlantic seaboard. Right, so this is the project he sets out for the citizens of the United States. And he says that this calculation for this more intimate union was freely given by your consent, and it's now rooted in a character, now he describes it, that has respect for the government's authority, is compliant with its laws, acquiesces in its measures. These are the duties enjoined by the fundamental maxims of true liberty. So by tying yourself to the way this country, you want this country to run, and committing yourself to it is the way that you can assure your liberty. Because without that set of relationships, you are not going to be free. I mean, that's the bottom line here. All right? But then he goes on to say, but that respect for the government is rooted in the right of the people to make and alter their constitutions of government. So at bottom, the liberty turns on an appreciation that we still have the wherewithal to change the form of government under which we live. And this juxtaposition then gives rise to what I think he suggests is most characteristic of the American citizen, that each accepts and believes that the Constitution, which at any time exists, till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. And keep those words in mind, because they're going to come back. Right, we're going to hear them again. He goes on to say, the very idea of power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. Now, he's not a romantic about this, and he does warn about the baneful effects of faction, right? And argues that we have to be careful of the breaking apart of this union, right? But having gone through these issues on political character, he also understands there's a moral component to this, and says, look, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And with that, he goes on to suggest that morality requires religion, and therefore we have to have education. And now there's another set of tensions that get produced into the system, right? So we need religion, morality, and education as the underpinning for those political for those political virtues. So only after he goes through all of this does he get to foreign policy. All right? Foreign policy is at the end of the farewell address. And there he turns his attention to those foreign matters. But even in his discussion of foreign affairs, he is focused on the formation of the character of the American citizen. Right? We remember it only as no entangling alliances. That was a consequence, not a cause. Right? Because what he says is that he is looking for a prudent statesmanship to guide us through those relationships. And having been such, he takes us through a survey of international affairs and shows us all of those things which don't cause a binding of the country. Remember, we have the fight between the English and the French. The government is completely disrupted by all of this. The country is almost at war with itself over this issue. And he says, look, do you understand what this is doing to us? Go back to this unity of government, the idea that we're all here on the same cause. Look what is happening to us. We can't permit ourselves to let this take place. So in this observation, which is to say we have no political connection to those people, by which he means they're not Americans. Right? They're something else. They're French, they're German, they're Spanish. They could be Americans. Remember, he said you are a citizen by birth or by choice. But the choice is you have to accept a way of life that he has here described. Right? So by abandoning by insisting on our own, we are able to make that separation and establish for ourselves the character traits that then, again, as a theme of the united government, follows through. What does that united government need to do in order to create amicable relations with others? And he says, for that, we're going to have to develop and have an exalted sense of justice and benevolence toward those countries, informed by a clear-eyed appreciation, and this is important, that the United States at no distant period will be a great nation. Right? So we can be just and benevolent and patient because we're going to be big and strong. Right? We have no dependencies. Right? And what he means by an exalted sense of justice, he then gives in his treatment of the way domestic strife has taken place. And he says, look, it should be policy to avoid permanent antipathies or attachments with foreign powers. These habits of mind, right, we're back to habits, lead to slave-like behavior where the passions lead the people and the nation away from its duty and interests. They have, he says, no interests. Their interests and ours are only remotely in concert. And we need not on a regular basis look to engage them unless there's something that we have an interest in doing. Right? Otherwise, we don't need to be involved. There is no reason for Americans to develop those political connections with foreigners, he says. In this liberated state, that is, understanding that our political connections are ours to decide, the nation can habituate itself to act justly. So we keep coming to this habituation, right? Habituate yourself in acting justly. So the habits of justice are made easier by the sure knowledge that the country will be immune, as I said, to injury, right? And we can decide, as he says, as our justice shall counsel. Then he goes back and refers again to the issues with the foreign powers and comes up with the line that most people can remember, right? And that if we do this right, we will be able, so far as it's humanly possible, to have command of our own fortunes. The United States will have command of its own fortunes. So as I said earlier, that phrase is often associated with foreign affairs, but command of one's own fortunes, of the country's own fortunes, requires the development of the character necessary to be able to do so. All of what he said is what is necessary to be able to command one's own fortunes, and that command is not only with respect to foreigners, but it's with respect to the people of the United States themselves. All right? So he's tied those things together in a neat little bow and described for us the necessity for building that kind of character which permits us to command our own fortunes. All right. So we leave Washington and we turn our attention to Lincoln. And I titled this section Lincoln's Project, and for reasons that we'll see as we go. In Lincoln's time, of course, foreign affairs were not a matter of concern. It was pretty well established that the country was going to be just fine, thank you very much. But the course of our domestic politics was much more rife with angst and concern, and was being set by the unhappy evolution of opinion on slavery. Right? And we know how that course turned out. And we understand that its eventual termination of that course of slavery gave rise to Lincoln's anticipation of a new birth of freedom. But that course and its eventual outcome was unknown and unknowable to those who were engaged in the political struggle to preserve and extend or to abolish slavery. They didn't know how it was going to turn out. Right? We sort of look back and say, oh, inevitable. No, it wasn't inevitable. And Lincoln understood that it wasn't inevitable. Right? But he did understand that it put at risk that unity of government that Washington spoke of. Right? So his lifelong project was to shape the American national character so that it could resolve the issue of slavery, so that, in his words, unity of government which constitutes Americans one people remained as dear to the American people then and going forward as Washington contended it did in his farewell. So how do we preserve this union? Because if we can't preserve the union, all of those other opportunities for the development of the type of character we believe is possible under the form of government we created will be lost. So he sets the stakes, of course, in his House Divided speech. We all remember it, and I don't need to quote it extensively, but it is important to remember that when he gave the speech, he said, the Dred Scott decision was supposed to put this to rest. But here we are 5 years later. Not only has it not been put to rest, it's getting worse. Right? This issue of slavery is agitation, as he called it, is not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. No, he doesn't tell you what the passage will be, only that there will be a crisis and that it will be passed. Now, Lincoln didn't expect the house to fall, right? But he was clear that he thought there was only going to be one of two outcomes. Either it was going to be all free or all slave. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Let's go back to where we were with Washington. I mean, if we come to the view collectively that slavery is a good thing, it cannot be contained only in the South, and it cannot be contained only in the territories. It has to be, and Dred Scott showed the way, it would have to be legal everywhere. And if it was not going to be legal in the territories, and it was not going to be legal in the other states, eventually, he believed, it would come to be illegal, if not eliminated, in the South. Right? And in his view, the solution to this problem, you remember Stephen Douglas offered up the notion of squatter rights. The people who are in the local territories can decide for themselves whether to vote slavery up or down. And Lincoln said, well, that ain't going to work. It doesn't fit with the whole unity government thing, first of all. But secondly, it has an implication which is impossible not to understand. Right? And that is that position left us with the notion that under the Constitution, no national government could prevent or prohibit slavery if a majority in a defined place said they wanted it. So let's go back to that respect question, right? Where Washington says you got to have a respect for other people's opinions. What this means is the majority essentially becomes decisive with this question of morality for all of the people of the United States, many of whom would oppose slavery. So how do we get through this? Becomes Lincoln's project. So he declared the theory amounted to nothing more, Lincoln did, that if one man chooses to enslave another, no third man shall be allowed to object. And if that was the basis for government, then obviously there is no room for amity, comity, mutually understood commitment, right? And Washington's efforts to create those habits of mind will be gone. So Lincoln's challenge is to give voice to the American national character that can resolve this problem. So he's looking to establish for the American people, to remind the American people of their capacity, intellectually, constitutionally, and morally, to resolve this question of slavery in the territories. He said, look, it's yours to decide. Right? Douglas is wrong. The notion that a majority can determine this question is not right. We have to be able to address it, all of us, let's go back to where Washington was, in our constitutional capacities. We have to decide, does the Constitution permit this or does it not? In his view, of course, it did not. In his Cooper Union speech, he tells us why. And though it reads very much like a lawyer's brief, it's clearly parsed in a way and phrased in a way that allows all of us who haven't been educated in the law how to understand it. It is, all right, an example of the kind of persuasion of civil discourse needed among citizens to effect a consequential change in policy, right, which is to say a constitutional matter. So Lincoln declares that ordinary Americans can understand just as well as the founders did that the Constitution did not forbid the federal government from prohibiting slavery in the territories. And by engaging the public, what he says to them is, you are on a par with the founders. You can decide this question just as they decided it. There was nothing about their time and their intellect that you don't share, particularly because you're all Americans, right? And you've been raised in the understanding of the moral fabric of the country. All right? So what he's looking to do in that statement is then to say, look, if you understand it, the issue, then you have a moral obligation to do something about it. So now you see putting in one place, right, this question of what's your character, what's your moral understanding of these things, and a question of policy. And you're obliged to put them together, and in doing so, you will define, in essence, your character. All right, so how does he do it? So the Cooper Union is one of the toughest sets of arithmetic I've ever been through. But what he does, essentially, is he goes through the votes of 39 founders who subsequently had votes related to the subject of slavery and says, look, in 21 of the 39 cases, they've consistently voted against it. In other cases, they were for and against, so it all depended. The important point was that all 39 of them understood they had, under the Constitution, in their statutory role, that is, as legislators, the authority to decide one way or the other. And deciding to allow slavery into the territory is nothing to say that I couldn't prohibit it. It's just that for reasons of expediency, he says, some of them decided to permit it. Now, the Constitution, he says, cannot allow you to do that which is unconstitutional, even though it be expedient. But the Constitution may allow you to do those things which are either expedient or inexpedient, depending on the circumstances in which you find yourself. So there is the moral charge, right, to the democratic citizen. Right? The Constitution will permit it, but is it a right thing to do or not? And how do I get from where I am to where I want to find myself in the end? So he concludes all this, and he says, even those who voted against it, as I said a moment ago, may have done on the grounds of expediency. No one who has sworn to support the Constitution can conscientiously vote for what he understands to be an unconstitutional measure, however expedient he may think it. But one may and ought to vote against a measure which he deems constitutional, if at the same time he deems it inexpedient. All right, now so what he's telling you, this is not easy to be a citizen. All right? But you have the capacity to do this. And so he defines the American national characteristic essential to maintaining the unity of a Republican form of government, the habit of mind that gives rise to prudential decision-making on how to best implement the law under the Constitution. So then we got a question we have before us. Okay, so how do we bring other people into this argument? Right? Because we know the slaveholders, they're kind of not keen on this notion. All right? So, and remember what his project is. His project is to sustain the Union, first and foremost. Right? We all remember his famous letter. Right? I'd get rid of slavery, I'd keep it, I'd do anything, but I got to save the Union. All right? So his project here is to try to find a way that the unity of the country can be maintained in unconstitutional measures, either by the slaveholders or by the abolitionists, not be taken. Because once the Constitution is destroyed, there is no hope, not only about slavery, but about the possibility of human beings living under this form of government. So he goes to the Lyceum. And this is earlier now, so we're going backwards actually in the chronology. And in the Lyceum address, he worries about mob violence. Right? And at bottom, mob violence boils down to essentially not much different than slave relationships, right? The mobs come and by force of power, they kill people. They lynch them, they ride them on rails, they tar and feather them, and murder them. And as a consequence, he worries about how we can have a country of laws if this becomes the disposition of the public. How is that possible? We can't do it, right? And civil society can't live in the context, in the thrall of mob violence. So what does he say? He says the remedy is that every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity must swear by the blood of the Revolution. So he takes us back, right? Never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country and never to tolerate their violation by others. And now you're hearing the reflections from Washington, right? From this, Lincoln is moved to proclaim that reverence for the law must become the political religion of the nation, and let the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the grave and the gay, all sexes and tongues and colors and conditions sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars. Well, this notion of political religion, I must say, does sound odd to the contemporary American ear, maybe even incomprehensible to some. But Lincoln knew what he was talking about. And he knew his audience would know what he was talking about. Religion, as a system of belief, imposes on its believers a discipline morally and in their reasoning, that enjoins them from doing that which their faith prohibits. One cannot at the same time be a member of a denomination and unfaithful to its tenets. And likewise for being an American. Right? You can't have it both ways. So Lincoln's audience understood this, and many would believe that through religion, salvation, that is the escape from the trials and tribulations of life into the happiness of living now or in the hereafter, with the rewards of one's faith, could be attained. Now, the Second Great Awakening was abroad in the land. Right? I mean, we forget these things. I mean, so there was this huge religious revival around the country. And Protestant denominations were increasing in both congregants and adherents. And it's worth taking a moment from an observation named by a fellow named Howe on what that all meant. And he said, look, the decision for Christ that the revivalists demanded had to be made voluntarily and responsibly. So you enter into a religion. Remember, you become a citizen either by birth or by choice. So here, right, Lincoln is reminding that you enter into this political religion, this commitment to the law, voluntarily and responsibly. Having taken the decision, the believer, regardless of the denomination, should accept self-discipline while also engaging in long-term moral self-improvement, sometimes called sanctification. The preachers urged people to search the Scripture for themselves and apply the lessons they found there to their own lives. In short, the believer was expected to remake himself or herself into a new person, to be born again. Right? To be born again. So now think about the new birth of freedom. Okay, so this is Lincoln in 38, right? Confronting this notion of what it means for sanctification, moral self-improvement, and what it can yield. So in Howe's description, you can see how Lincoln can be appealing to them for their conversion from the lawless mob into a people with the capacity to govern themselves, right? And self-government, moral improvement. Each of them and all of them together. Right? So it wasn't just that you did it by yourself, you had to do it with your fellow citizens. And beseeching them to curb their passions voluntarily. For no other method could be done. Only if it's voluntary does it matter. In favor of abiding by the law, Lincoln is not so foolish as to ask them to surrender to injustice. Now remember what we heard from Washington on this subject. Bad laws, he says, should be repealed as soon as possible, but while they continue in force, for the sake of example, they should be religiously observed, if not too intolerable. If not too intolerable. All right. So then we still now have a problem, which is, okay, so we get all these people in the room, we're all committed to it, but I still got this thing about persuading those who are not yet on my side. So now if we turn to his Temperance Address, he gives us a clue as to how you do that. All right, so the temperance movement, which recurs in the 20s here in the US, right, was all about you couldn't drink. And the way that it was done in the beginning, as he says, the old movement, was to shame those who either drank or sold drink. And you shamed them into submission. And he says, this is not going to work because the people whom you are shaming believe neither that what they're doing is wrong and it isn't illegal. Right? So if we think about the slaveholder, we got the same problem, don't we? They don't think about what they're doing is wrong, and it was legal. So how do you get to persuasion? Well, the temperance movement went through a change, and they started to bring the former drunks around to help persuade other people that it was not a good thing to do, and that was not a bad idea. But he says, the trouble with that is you're not satisfied with those conversions. You are demanding that others who may not share your fervor in this matter, now think of the abolitionists, right? You are insisting that they become teetotalers. I discovered this in this speech. So a teetotaler was somebody who, at the end of his signature, put a T next to his name as a signature that he had taken the pledge. All right? So you are insisting that these people who, again, may agree with you that generally this is not what we want to see in society, do not want to be a part of this arrangement and would much prefer to be helpful at a distance. And you can't insist. You can't turn your religion into an ideology. Because once you've done that, you have separated the one from the other. Right? So he's pretty straightforward in his warning. If you view those whom you are trying to persuade as morally inferior because they don't subscribe to your ideology, they will never trust you. Right? You can't treat them as your friends. You can't treat them as your fellow citizens. They are others. And we can't get to where we want to go if half of us is treating the other half as others. So we've got to find a way through this problem. And so one comes away from this review of Lincoln's work with the keen impression that Lincoln believed that an essential trait of the American character is empathy, and maybe even a disposition toward friendliness, if not friendship, for and with fellow citizens. For a friend can be persuaded in a disagreement. That is certainly not the case for one is thought to be unpersuadable or an enemy. And in that you hear again that echo of Washington on civility. Now, sad fact of the matter is that in this project, Lincoln failed. He did not persuade the country to find a way to avoid going to war, maintaining unity, and finding a way out of the problem of slavery. He failed. But he remained determined at Gettysburg and then his second inaugural to restore the tattered bonds of friendship. Remember the words. Between those on either side of the slavery question. And he has no choice, for while his mission was to find, if possible, a friendly way to resolve the crisis, preserving the Union was the ultimate objective, because if he doesn't persuade the Union, there is no basis for friendship in the type of government we had designed for ourselves. All right. So the new birth of freedom, right, becomes necessary to redeem the last best hope for Earth, which is this unified government and the people it had created in the experiment of self-government. All right, now, so we've gone through the issues of self-government, majority rule, civility, and all the rest. And we did this through the 18th and the 19th century. We're now about to make an abrupt change, because the next of our major leaders to turn to is Teddy Roosevelt. Now, anybody who was known for carrying a big stick, you got to figure is a little short on let's all get along, right? So Teddy comes to the presidency, much like Lincoln did, by the way, at a time when what we might refer to as the second founding generation had passed, right? So Lincoln comes into the public eye in the 30s, 1830s. Jefferson, Adams, Madison, right? They've all recently died. And with Teddy's arrival at the turn of the century, most of that generation from the Civil War is gone. So there's a new generation needing to be instructed in the way of citizenship. But there's also a fundamental change in the character of the country. It has gone from being a highly agricultural society to one that is increasingly urbanized. Immigration is at an all-time high. And who would have thunk it, but income inequality is rampant. And by the way, if you want to go back and see what income inequality is, go look at Carnegie and all of those guys against the folks today. The folks today are pikers compared to those guys. I mean, they had more money than God and weren't afraid to use it. So Roosevelt comes into office with that problem in his mind. That is to say, there is a rising lower and middle class in the country that is demanding its place in this government and in need of some of what Roosevelt believes is essential government support. And so in this, Roosevelt is perfectly happy to capture what he says is the way that Lincoln approached government. So let's go back to the constitutional but expedient, all right? And remember Washington and Lincoln on this question, because Roosevelt is going to take the view that as long as the Constitution says I can't do it, I can do anything I want. Okay, that's what it boils down. That's where the stick comes from. All right, now, if you want to think forward, it's not much different, by the way, than the phone and the pen that President Obama spoke about after his election in 2012, when he was frustrated with the capacity to move the country in the direction he thought it necessary for it to move. So these things do tie together, you see. I mean, there's a thread in here. So Roosevelt comes to office unabashedly in favor of expanding the authority of government, particularly the executive authority. And in his autobiography, he says, look, I'm going to tell you that men who understand and practice the deep underlying philosophy of the Lincoln School of American political thought are necessarily Hamiltonian in their belief in a strong and efficient national government, and Jeffersonian in their belief in the people as the ultimate authority, and in the welfare of the people as the end of government. Now, that's a new formulation, isn't it? We hadn't heard that from Washington. We hadn't heard it from Lincoln, where the welfare of the people is the end of government. Right? Before, the end of government had been to create the circumstances under which the people could look to their welfare. This has now changed. The purpose of the government is to look to the welfare of the people. And when we get to his cousin, Franklin will tell you that unless the government looks to the welfare of the people, liberty is not possible. Democracy is not possible. Right? So Bernie Sanders has his roots, right, back in Franklin's day. So these things are all part of that effort, again, to meld that American character. So Teddy's view is that that Hamiltonian Jeffersonian approach, which is the right one, was actually intercepted early in the Republic by those who, following Jefferson, gave rise to what he calls individualism. He says these are the men who first applied the extreme democratic theory in American life, who were ultra-individualists. For at that time, what was demanded by our people was the largest liberty for the individual. During the century that had elapsed since Jefferson became president, the need had been exactly reversed. That is to say, back then we had to worry about individuals. Now we have to worry about the general welfare. All right? And he says the inference he makes here, of course, is that the scale of interactions by the government has to grow in order to secure the general welfare. And the old theory, because he's going to come to call this the new nationalism, so let's call what had preceded it the federal nationalism. The federal nationalism did not supply the people, then or today, with the power to protect their rights. And why is that? He says, because a democracy can be, in fact, only if there is some rough approximation to similarity in stature among the men composing it. Right? So democracies, he's arguing, can't have variations. Everybody has to be more or less at the same level. So what happened to that whole business of finding respect for one another in our various things? No. Folks in a democracy are pretty much at the same level. And what's happened to us, all right, is these large corporations have come into being. And so where in the past we could deal with one another on an individual basis, we go to the fish market, we go to the bread market, go to the meat market, and we dealt with our opposite numbers as equals. Now we have the advent of the corporation. The corporation runs the country, and we, the people, cannot fight the corporation except through the government. All right? So the government becomes the instrument by which the people will level their relationship with the moneyed interests. And that implies then two things, doesn't it? They have to know what they want their government to do, and they have to be accepting of what the government does. So they have to have a character suited to that way of living, and they have to have the policies which are coincident with that character. Because if you got people who are still thinking they're individuals and individualism, let's take that as the moral character of the country prior to Roosevelt, that won't fit in this new world. So by Roosevelt's definition, the character of the country had to change. You couldn't be before and live later. It wouldn't work. You would rebel against the government as being tyrannical. And why? Because the majority would decide. And that's where Roosevelt takes us. Majority rule for Roosevelt becomes the key to success. And he says quite explicitly, I am tired of hearing of tyrannies of the majority. There is no such thing. How can there be? The majority rules, does it not? It cannot be tyrannical. And I, Teddy Roosevelt, am the tribune of that people, of that majority. And my task, and the task of every president from this point forward, is to bring that, what he calls the will of the people, the general welfare, the prevailing moral sentiment of the people, to give it voice and to translate it into policy. And remember, as long as the Constitution doesn't prohibit him from making that translation, then he and the federal government are free to put into place those changes. So in this elaboration, a redefinition of the role of the federal government in American life, he says, look, I did it, and I'm proud of it, and it wasn't usurpation. That is to say, he wasn't taking authority that he did not possess. But he had the authority to act, and absent, as I said earlier, the restrictions, he could do so. And he constantly told the people this, by the way. And in doing so, he used that as the way to habituate the public to this new form of government and action. So in a speech that he called The Right of the People to Rule, delivered in the opening days of his presidential campaign in 1912, he put his program forward. And this is where he claims that the American people have every capacity to rule in the majority. And I'm tired of talk of majority tyranny. He says, I shall protest against it with all my heart and soul wherever it should appear. And you say, oh, that's good. But you just encouraged it, right? So, I mean, we've got this interesting work. But there's a certain casualness in which Teddy Roosevelt, translates majority rule into self-government. Self-government becomes the decision about the laws you want to have passed, not about how you're going to live your life. Right? So the character that maybe once was worried about that civility that we talked about before, and that form of self-government, wherein the government is there to protect your liberty to make those kinds of decisions, that changes, right? And he's looking now for folks who understand that self-government is about the laws you pass, right? And essentially what you claim as the majority from those who have property. Right? Because the rich, all that inequality, is about property. And the property has been protected by what he calls the corrupt minority. In fact, he rails against what he calls the tyranny of the minority. He doesn't worry about the tyranny of the majority. He's worried about the tyranny of the minority because the individualism that he describes earlier, he says, was designed to prevent the government from doing things. And it was, right? It was meant to constrain the government in what it was capable of doing. He says, we got to get rid of that. We got to have the majority determine what the government is going to do. Right? So two observations emerge from all of this, and he says, he holds out for a system of national government in which he calls for direct elections. He says, the only remedy to all of this is to restore the power to govern directly to the people and to make the public servant directly responsible to the whole people and to no part of them, to no class of them, right? But to the whole people. Now, hold that thought because we're going to come back to it with President Obama. But of course, we never had such a government. That's not the government we had or have, right? Under the Continental Confederation or the federal construct. Direct democracy was consciously not chosen, right? Because we wanted the government limited, and we didn't want majorities to be able to run government policy in the way that Roosevelt would have us do, other than, of course, from the House. And the second observation, harsh though it may sound, is that Roosevelt has no interest in toleration, right? He thinks anybody who is not on his side is his enemy. So he's violating all of Lincoln's precepts, right, about the ideology giving rise to enmity which makes impossible the kind of government we want. All right. So in the end, as I said earlier, he says, and I'll close here on this and move on to his cousin. He says, under the title of the new nationalism, he says, in every wise struggle for human betterment, one of the main objects, and often the only object, has been to achieve in large measure equality of opportunity. In the struggle for this great end, nations rise from barbarism to civilization, and through it, people press forward from one stage of enlightenment to the next. Now, one of the chief factors in progress is the destruction of special privilege. The essence of any struggle for healthy liberty has always been, and must always be, to take from some one man or class of men the right to enjoy power or wealth or position or immunity which has not been earned by service to his or their fellows. Right? To take, right, from the others. Right? And he goes on to say then that the basis for property rights is that those who have property may enjoy it so long as that wealth is put to the good use of the general welfare. And if it is not, then those people are to be, and he's quite explicit about this, driven from political life, because they are the minority that oppresses, and they must be made gone. Now, he's smart enough to know that he can't kill capitalism. So we hear this going on today. So he says explicitly, look, on the other hand, we got to be careful, because those are the people who are generating the money who make it possible for us to do these things. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to put in a regulatory environment in which the government will control those interests so that they can't make too much money. Right? Now Franklin comes along, and Franklin says, you know, Teddy had it half right, but he didn't get it all right. All right? So let's go through this in a quick moment. In a campaign speech called Progressive Government he delivered in 1932, he looks to recast, FDR does, the political experience and provide it with a new foundation. And he picks up where Teddy left off. And he too, FDR, examines the implications of individualism, what Washington, Lincoln, and maybe Roosevelt might have termed liberty. FDR argues, as I suggested TR did, rightly, I believe, FDR argues, that this trait of individualism of the national character was developed and practiced for the express purpose of constraining government. But, says Roosevelt, the constraining of government was okay as long as you had a great frontier, unlimited wealth in the country, and if you had a problem, you picked your stuff up, you moved west, and you made your fortune someplace else. That's not possible anymore. And remember, he's talking in the midst of the Great Depression. Right? It's just not possible anymore for people to do that. Therefore, we have to rethink what it means to have a government and what the government should do, and by implication, you must be tired of hearing this, we have to rethink what the character of the public is going to be in support of that new program. All right? And so he says, look, once upon a time, it was really important that we had people who were moguls and created railroads and all that other kind of stuff. We ain't got no more time for that. That's over. We need to make sure that we have the capacity to redistribute wealth and products more equitably, adapting existing economic organizations to the service of the people, and so forth. He says, the day of enlightened administration has come. And herein he argues that the people want to see those kinds of policies, and that they understand that the power of the government is not unduly constrained in providing an answer to the public, that public demand. All right, and so he knows, FDR does, that in making this case, he is breaking with the Declaration and the founding. He knows it. He knows it explicitly because he tells us so. He says, the Declaration of Independence discusses the problem of government in terms of a contract. I've never thought of it as a contract, but he did. Government is a relationship of give and take, a contract perforce, if we would allow the thinking out of which it grew. Under such a contract, rulers were accorded power, and the people consented to that power on consideration that they may be accorded certain rights. I thought it was the other way around, right? But this is FDR's formulation. The task of statesmanship has always been the redefinition of these rights in terms of a changing and growing social order. New conditions impose new requirements upon government. So here he's explicitly restating, right, the basis of the founding, and therefore rejecting the theories of citizenship and moral authority that Washington and Lincoln had put forward. He goes on later in 1944 to lay out what turns out to be his social program, which is something we would all understand today. And at the heart of that social program is providing for every individual in the country a level of security. If we hear talk today of a basic national income, that is essentially what Franklin Roosevelt had in mind. Right? Now, it's in different terms, much more constrained. Right, but Social Security, right, is a base national income, actually, individual income. And he said the same about housing and education. You know, if you go back and read a speech in 1944, it is hardly different than the things we hear today, which brings us to President Obama. He too made a speech in Osawatomie, Kansas, just prior to the campaign for his second term. And he too ticks off the same kinds of concerns that Roosevelt and both Teddy and Franklin Roosevelt ticked off. And he argues that folks who are opposing the program that he offers simply have amnesia. They don't understand that all those old approaches, that old federalism, right, just don't work anymore. They're wrong, he says of those people. They're wrong. He doesn't say I disagree with them. He says they're wrong. So again, we're back to this question of how, and this is about our discourse, by the way. This is not the president being particularly difficult about this. Lord knows the one we have now is way worse. But there's something about the way the discourse has evolved, which is reflective of what the folk are expecting and what they are demanding in the way of the government's response. Now there's a number of points that we can make in here, and in the interest of time, let me come to what is the punchline here for President Obama. As part of his post-second election, he went to Berlin. It was his second trip to Berlin. And there, having laid out at Osawatomie 2 years earlier the range of programmatic policy choices that he thought the country should take, he went to Berlin to talk about the implications of the recovery that was taking place. There he says, the agenda I've laid out is the agenda of a new generation. But this new generation, we, and he includes himself in that generation, must accept the challenge that all of us in democratic governments face, to listen to the voices who disagree with us. So far, so good. To have an open debate about how we use our powers and how we must constrain them. And to always remember that government exists to serve the power of the individual and not the other way around. Now, I have been pondering this since I read it. All right? The government exists to serve the power of the individual, and not the other way around. Well, we never thought that the individual was there to serve the government. All right? But he argues that the government is there, the power of the individual, not the majority, but of the individual. Right? And in that, I think what we see is a reflection of the notions that we have seen in identity politics, right? The change in the way in which we look on Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, progressives and Democrats, right? There is this notion about individuality coming back into play, in which the need of the described individual, defined individual, has a claim on the power of government. And that produces a certain character way different than what a Washington would have talked about, a Lincoln talked about, a Teddy Roosevelt, even FDR talked about. That's a different kind of American citizen. Now, we haven't seen this end, right? I suspect we will not see this chapter play itself out for another 20 years. Right? But we're in the midst of another shift in this notion about what constitutes the American character. All right. I'll close with this. We've argued that the American character has been forged to habituate the American mind, and dare we say it, its soul, to a political idea that is perfect in its conception. Policy choices are properly subject to and require approval by public opinion. Because the just powers of government are derived from consent of the governed, policy changes of consequence, those national in scope that affect the mutual understanding at the root, right, the mutual understanding at the root of our unity and our comity among the people, require that those who would propose those changes in policy bear the burden of persuading their fellow citizens to concur. It's not an accident that the federal government is structured in accordance with Washington's first rule of civility. The structure does not merely encourage, but requires those seeking consequential changes to policy to secure more than a simple majority of those voting. The founders insisted that the body politic had to not merely reach a consensus on policy, but assure in each of its consequential decisions that majorities were not inappropriately thwarted, nor minorities overly compensated for their dissents. And so what do I mean by it's having been structured? Well, if you look at 3 co-equal branches of government, right? The way they're elected, the Electoral College, it's all designed to force those who want to make change to have to go to others and gain their agreements. Right? A simple majority wipes all that away. It's unnecessary. We don't have to go to anybody else. If there's enough of us, we win. Well, but is that really what is going to assure that we can live our lives with the kind of liberty that we would prefer? So another way of expressing this idea is to say that American citizens, by and large, are attentive to securing and protecting the inalienable rights of our fellow citizens to pursue their lives, their liberties, and private and public happiness, even as we pursue consequential changes to policy and law. We were established to be able to work that way. We are challenged today to see if we can sustain that character as we go through the turbulent times ahead. So there you are.
We will, of course, take some questions, and our protocol is to begin with students. So are there any student questions?
No, they're heading for the doors.
In the back.
Yes.
I'll let you take the questions yourself.
Yeah.
Favorite president and why?
Say again.
Favorite president and why?
Favorite president. It's not Buchanan. Favorite president. You know, it's probably trite, but I think that Washington probably had the closest understanding of the consequence of the structure of government that was put in place. He understood why it was more perfect. Lincoln understood that perfection had to be harnessed and channeled to make the country great. Right? But if we can grasp Washington's understanding of why the Union was more perfect, I think we do ourselves a great service.
Thank you. If there's another student, I'm sorry.
Feel free, go ahead.
My question is, your whole speech was on history, that we should learn from history.
Yep.
And yet today, you see, in my opinion, a large part of the population saying we can't learn from history because they were white founders, male, and also they were slave owners and they were sinful and all
It's all
that.
true.
Yes, it's all true.
Okay?
But, you know, I mean, I guess my point is we need to overcome that misunderstanding.
Yes.
Because as Joseph Ellis said, if they were scoundrels, we shouldn't study them. If they were deity, we can't be them. So therefore, since they were men and women that rose to the occasion during their lifetime, we should and can study them. But that, I guess it wasn't a question, I apologize.
No, that's quite all right.
Because that's the thing that we need to get back to people so that they can then say, yes, I can learn from history. That's my point.
That's right. So the challenge we have today is to think our way through those things which are acceptable given the change in attitude about many, many, many things that have occurred. Those things which are worthy of tough debate and argument and true political contest. And we've got to try to persuade ourselves that there are very, very, very few things that it's worth putting the whole thing at risk for. And figuring that out and coming to an agreement about not going after those few things, right, is sort of the challenge. And that's only done by us. I mean, there's nobody else out there to do it. I mean, who else is going to do it? Yes?
I really enjoyed the lecture. It was a great sweep. When you birth of freedom, I like the phrase, it sounds like something that Professor Henry Jaffa would have used in a book.
Well, he did borrow it.
And I think you described 4 births. And maybe we're emerging toward a 5th birth, you don't know. Is the child born each time, has that child been a better child than his predecessor?
Well, so that's a matter of a political debate, right? I would argue unquestionably the first 2 times, yes. So let me rephrase your question. Is the reformulation of government by Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, which asserted the primacy of governmental authority in meeting the needs of the general population, are we better off for that? And the answer is an uncomfortable yes and no. So it's unquestionable that in a country of such wealth, that we should have a kind of feeling, empathy for our fellow citizens, that we're prepared to be helpful in allowing them to live decent lives. On the other hand, encouraging the notion that there is a claim upon each of us by others by virtue of who or what we do seems to be excessive. Right? I mean, that's my view of it. And each generation in its own way has come back around to that appreciation. I mean, let's not forget that Teddy and his policies had to survive through McKinley, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. Who am I missing? Before Franklin, Taft was there at the time. before Franklin was able to, again, reformulate his notion. And that generation not only got through the war and built the country in the 50s and got through the civil rights movement and all, I mean, they did pretty damn well, okay, all things considered. So was it a bad thing? No. Is it what it was? No, and it probably can't be. So what are we going to do with this becomes the question. And as I said a moment ago, unless we are willing to engage in the same kind of reflection and to engage in the same kind of conversation with folks, right, it's kind of hard to know how this round is going to turn out. Right? The sides are drawn. I mean, it's about as clear as you're going to get at the moment. How that gets resolved, we'll see. I don't know.
So, kind of different question, but if you go to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, as you look at Jefferson on the left-hand panel, are his words in which he implies that the Constitution should be able to be rewritten.
Uh-huh.
So in your discussion, did any of the key figures you talked about or people who referred to editors ever strongly propose rewriting the Constitution?
No.
Because we do live in a time, probably in the last 30 years, for a variety of reasons, in which personally I can see a desperate need to rewrite the Constitution.
Yeah.
But it scares the crap out of most people.
Well, it should. I mean, it was close to perfect the first time. It's kind of hard to get better, because, for the reasons I gave at the end. I mean, so the Constitution you can think of as one of two things, and I owe this to Dr. Allen here. I mean, you either think about it as the rules of the game, or you think about it as a form of statutory law, right? The founders thought about it as the rules of the game. The Roosevelts fell into the middle, all right, and they looked at what Lincoln had done on the draft, freeing the slaves, right, all of those things, which he himself admitted in some of those cases he had not the authority to do, but for the military circumstances, right? And they said, well, look, we can do the same thing. And so Roosevelt, Teddy, explicitly, as I said, asserts that if the Constitution says I can't do it, I can do it. FDR says, whatever it meant, we're just going to say it means this. Okay. Did any of them suggest amending? Yes, is the answer. So we've had amendments to the Constitution. All right. You're right. Not well. Depends on how you think about some of the amendments and what you think about the subsequent court rulings on those things, right? So the meanings attached to portions of the Constitution we have today, while not foreign, I believe, to the founders, they would probably find astonishing, if not disappointing. Right? But we own it, and we're the ones who are going to have to make do otherwise if we don't like it the way it is. Yes?
Do you think Washington and company would have made the same set of rules under the circumstances that exist today? Because harkening back to this other question, the comment over here about learning from the past, I just can't help but to think that the rules and the population and everything was so very different 200 some odd years ago that, of course, at the time it seemed like the perfect document, but today it has to be different.
Yeah, so let me separate two things. If it's the rules, I have a hard time thinking of better rules. If what you are trying to do is to bring a legislative, judicial, and executive together over a country of large extent with multiple interests of varying sizes, it's designed to force that thing to come together to agree on how it's going to go forward. So on that, I'm not sure I can find it. On the notion that, and I'm growing tired of the never before in human history have we seen. So if we go back to the 1780s, 90s, and the 1800s, Citizen Genet was Vladimir Putin. The French government was the Soviet government, or you call them the Chinese government. They were meddling in the domestic affairs of the United States. They were trying to throw the elections. The folks on the Whiskey Rebellion, or Occupy Wall Street. We sent an army after them. No, quite seriously, I'm not trying to so the scope or scale is different. But of course, it didn't take them but 5 or 6 days to go from one place to another. So the speed at which things happened was different. But the issues, I suggest, were not that different in terms of their implications for the character of the people. Because we're all human beings. The only reason we understand what happened then is because we understand what happens today. We're all human beings. Thucydides. Why did Thucydides write the history of the Peloponnesian Wars? He wrote the history of the Peloponnesian because he was confident that no matter how many centuries would go by, human beings would understand what he was talking about. So we've been here. We've done this, right? It's just we approach it differently. We've educated ourselves differently. We've habituated ourselves differently, and we have allowed for policies, right, that reflect that change in thought and habituation. Now, I'll give you something on social media that makes it hard. But as a political matter, I don't think it's that's stunningly different. Could be wrong. The immigration flow, we're way out of time. The immigration flow at the end of the 19th century was unbelievable. Colleen can tell you about what it took to clean the streets of New York, what the tenements looked like in the city. Because I presented him in class one day. It was horrible. There were millions of people pouring into this country who didn't speak the language, didn't have jobs. Right? And it was after the West closed. So it wasn't in the 1830s, although there was a group that came in the 30s. This was the West is closed, industrialization is full bore, and we took in millions. And the political implications of that were enormous. So the progressive movement has its roots, right, in that change. It's not in William Jennings Bryan on Cross of Gold and all that. That was yesterday's news. Right? It was the millions and millions and millions of immigrants who came in. And they were accommodated. They were absorbed. Right? My grandmother came in that batch. Right? So we've done this before. Right? All right? We've just chosen to do it differently. And to come to grips with whether we're comfortable, given the fact that it was done differently before under similar circumstances, leaves you with the opportunity to ask yourself, is there a different policy to be proposed? And could I persuade my fellow citizens that that different policy is just to us and to the immigrant, right, and good for the country?
How can you do that if you don't understand your fellow citizen?
That's where we are. That's where we've driven ourselves. That's what I think the consequence of President Obama's statement is. All right? That individuals have come to expect that the government services them, and therefore their requirement to, if you will, deal horizontally with their fellows is less important because there's a direct connection. Right? We call them entitlements, but it's more than that. There's an expectation of support, recognition, right?
This population, we talked about respect with Washington. And there was a respect because they were ingrained in the population, as I understand it. They were commerce, they were farmers, they had a life away from Washington DC.
Yes.
Of which their well-being depended upon.
True.
It didn't matter where you were. I don't care if you're.
You didn't have a
Massachusetts
political
or-
class like you do today.
You
True.
didn't have a lot of classes. You had people that were pretty much ingrained with one another, so respect, I think, would be something they could have a common language with one another as to what they were trying to achieve in light of the Declaration of Independence. Compare that and contrast that with what we have today, and then how you get the character of what we're trying to achieve as far as a country that can
Yeah.
advance and be significant.
I don't. I'm not trying to not answer the question, but again, the historical illusion is Washington leaves office having made more enemies than he could stand, and he made those enemies because he pushed the programs that developed with Hamilton and right. So the political environment in the 1796 to 1810-12 timeframe was absolutely vicious. It was as vicious as anything today.
Yeah.
It was as vicious as anything today. Jefferson gets away with hiring a clerk in the State Department to come in and write broadsheets attacking Washington, the man for whom he works.
It wasn't broadcast like it is now.
It was as broad, well, this goes back to the point of how long it took.
Yeah.
So they reprinted and printed and printed again in the newspaper. So the reason that you can get this history, and you can get it in South Carolina as easily as you can get it in Massachusetts, is those newspapers reprinted that news. So the country understood what was going on. There was a delay in it, which probably had the effect of driving down the immediate tensions, which unfortunately don't have today. I mean, you're bombarded all the time with this noise. And so, yes, I think you're making a point. The ability to step back, reflect a bit, and all the rest. But I will suggest this. The single greatest threat that has appeared to American democracy is air conditioning. Air